how many working groups you guys get, but that's all right. Shall we start? Yeah. Fine. Good morning. Welcome to the DTN Working Group meeting. This meeting is under the note well, which essentially says that everything you say or you write is covered under those RFCs. This is a proposed agenda. BPBIS update, BPSec, TCPCL with a remote presenter. Who is not yet there. We'll see. And AMA. Any suggestions or changes to the agenda? Okay. Ed has agreed to take notes as usual. If you don't agree or if you want to help, it would be great to help while he's presenting. So if anybody wants to do additional note taking during Ed's presentation would be good. Any volunteer? Oh well. We've done a working group. Yeah.
We also, a Jabber scribe would be really helpful. Someone just to monitor what's happening on Jabber and take any questions.
We did a working group last call on DTN BPBIS and TCPCL V4. There were some comments. There was actually a group of people met yesterday to discuss some of those, and both will be discussed in the next presentations. And this is a recall of our current charter, which there's a lot of to do. Okay, so Scott, first.
Actually, can I just quickly interrupt at this point? We'd really like some more review on BPPIS and TCPCL. So if you can find yourself a couple of hours to just read it through once more, because these drafts are being updated, and just get some good quality review, just even if it's spotting typos. It just we need some more eyes on these documents. Okay. So you'll have to show the next slide.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
Good.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Just a quick review of the status of the BP-BIS.
Right, I'm not sure if it works.
Okay. Bundle protocol specification. Let's see. That works.
Cool.
Okay. The latest draft that is available on the website is 06. It was posted in October, and we got comments from Carlo Caini at University of Bologna on the 30th, and Kevin Fall on the 13th of November after that, from Brian on the 15th of November. We talked about it at IETF 97, and there was a security considerations section put together just after that last meeting in response to discussions we had at that time. There were more comments that came in on November 30th and December 4th, and we began working group last call, the second working group last call on the 6th of January. That ended on the 3rd of February. And the working group last call comments came from Fred Templin, Carlo, Brian, Stephen Farrell, Capali, Rick, Mark, and Lucas Collard. The status of the document is that we've been collecting all the comments, still waiting for consensus on some of the points that were brought up in the comments on the mailing list. Most of the review comments are editorial. There were a couple that actually were technical changes to the protocol specification. One, adding a reason code for complement exceeded, and the other, somewhat more major, would be moving the CRC to the end of the blocks instead of having it in the header of the blocks, which we can certainly talk about. It's a doable thing. And maybe making the CRC a fixed-length byte string. And there was also one major, I would say, procedural comment that Stephen brought up, that we should hold up the location of the BP specification until the BP security specification is also through the working group last call.
Can I ask you to do that from one?
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Okay, and that's it. That's the status right now, and it's open for discussion. And if there are any questions, ask me questions.
Would you want me to do it?
Some of us have met yesterday for going through all the comments. One of the things that were found was that the text for custody transfer was maybe not fully complete or something and needs more work. So one of the ideas that was agreed between the people was to actually remove that part, make a separate draft, and then having that part being handled in, so remove the custody transfer, all custody related stuff into a separate document. So we're looking for if the working group does think it makes sense.
Can I add to that? The proposal is to take the custody transfer out to another document, but that would be a working group document. So it's not being discarded, and it would be kept being worked on as one of our primary charter items.
And that separate document actually would be drafted right away. That's not something to slip for a long time.
Hey, Stephen Farrell. Yes, I think that's a good idea. I think the one thing you didn't say was to leave in the custody requested flag in the current document so that you can sign it. But to try and basically take away everything that talks about custody, but leave everything that is needed to have a separate document to make sense about custody, which I think is a great idea.
Yeah, or just another comment of support for that idea.
Oh, good. There was a point.
As Jabber described, Keith Scott, I assume he wants me to relay it, he didn't say, but he's saying he's strongly opposed to removing custody transfer to another document. It's Keith Scott.
Okay. It would be good to have some rationale, or, you know, why or why not. It's just a document change, right? Doesn't.
We do have time in the agenda to discuss this properly. I don't want to push this straight to the list. If people want to, because we are meeting face to face, it's a good opportunity to discuss this.
Rand Atkinson, but what you guys have done is beg the question. No one has said we're going to do this change because it solves this problem. And I don't really care, but it has not in any way been articulated why.
So, Stephen Farrell again. I think that's a fair point. So one of the comments I had was that if you combine custody transfer and fragmentation, there are some corner cases that are just not covered in the document. It's not clear exactly how you would cover them. So it was one of the comments I sent on the list. So I think the scenario was if you have fragmentation and custody and you get custody transfer reports back to the custodian with fragmentation, it can really end up, well, in the current text, there are some things that it's not clear what you should do. I personally think it's maybe impossible to fix. You can get custody to work and be useful in a bunch of places, but maybe not always everywhere. So I think that's the justification for maybe taking it into a separate document and having that worked on separately. But leaving the base document have the custody requested flag so that it can still work.
Rick, speaking personally rather than with my chair hat on, I can see the advantage in pulling the custody transfer text out into its own document is to keep the base BP BIS document smaller and tighter and making sure that we can get that through working group last call and get it into the IESG chain. So we're trying to just divide and conquer the problem here because some people have questions over custody transfer, but it looks like the rest of BPBIS has general consensus that this is the right way to go and is going to work properly and has been, you know, there's running code and rough consensus that this is good. And I also personally wonder that the set of people looking to use BPBIS and the set of people looking to use BPBIS with custody transfer are two different sizes. And I think custody transfer is of immediate importance to a far smaller group. And so let's just try and divide the problem up and get some real progress on this, because otherwise we could hold up BPBIS with custody transfer corner cases forever. And this doesn't mean we're not doing custody transfer. It's happening. It's just we're going to try and decouple the problem.
Fred Templin from Bowen. So I echo that, and I just like to say that in the IETF in general, I think we're starting to see a trend where we're more smaller and more modular documents rather than bigger and monolithic documents seem to me moving forward with a little bit less snags. So I agree with the approach.
So just echoing Keith again. And apologies for I lost network for a minute, so I'm not sure if it kind of is in sequence. But Keith says, if we decouple custody transfer, then it may allow nodes to just not ever implement reliability. They'll implement the base 50/50 BIS and just not implement the custody transfer extension. He's remote, so if you're going to answer, you should go. Mike.
People might choose not to do that anyway, right? So
It's optional. From my reading of BPBIS, it's optional in the document anyway, isn't it? Custody transfer? No, it's mandatory. Okay, I've misread it.
Well, I think this is Scott. I think the document says that no node is ever required to take custody, and in that sense, it's optional. If you did an implementation in which it was impossible to take custody, it would be a conformant implementation.
Spencer Dawkins, responsible AD. Since somebody mentioned modular documents going to the ISG, I would point out to you that I'm also the responsible AD for NFSv4. So anybody who sends modular documents up is going to make me a happy AD.
So Rick again. Does anyone have a technical argument for why we should keep the two custody transfer and the base BP-BIS rolled together in one? I'm sort of giving Keith, who seems to be the main proponent of that, another opportunity to suggest anything while we're discussing it. Otherwise, we shall take this to the list, but I think we need to make a decision on the split pretty quickly.
I think that's really a key point. Is there a technical argument for making custody transfer essentially mandatory, and if it is optional, then it seems like it doesn't matter whether it's included in the same specification or in a separate book.
So again, echoing Keith, he says, all it takes is one node in the path to not implement custody transfer to require, in order to provide reliability, source-based retransmit. And then he says, is the intent of the document split to submit, approve them in a separate sequence, or will they follow separate paths? Then in brackets, base approved fully while the custody doc follows its own path. That's it. So he's the second one is he's asking, will they go together or like one after the other, I guess.
Is he asking whether the two IETF documents would go at the same time, or is he asking about the split between the way IETF does it and the way CCSDF does it?
Excuse me, that last question was Brian Seapost, and not Keith. So Brian is saying, he's asking, will they be pushed forward together or separately?
And I would say that, well, from my perspective, they should be pushed forward together if possible, but I don't think that the custody transfer specification should hold up the BP-BIS specification.
I think based on the discussions we had yesterday, the intention is to make the custody transfer document a normative reference from BP-BIS, push them through the IESG at the same time and let them meet in the editor's queue at the end, or push them through when they're both ready and hold them in the editor's queue. But I'm happy for the working group to tell me that they want to do it in a different way.
So Brian says, I'm not against the split in any way, just trying to understand.
Yeah.
I think part of the argument there is that if there is a separate document that is just devoted to custody transfer, then all of the potential issues can be addressed in one place, and it will make reasoning about the way it works somewhat easier for implementers and for people designing the protocol.
Yeah, as me, again, it's as Stephen Pearl. I think that's correct. I mean, because, based on deployments we've done, that the handling custody is like a weird thing and hard. And I think having that having the considerations around custody transfer and retransmission in a separate document, I think will be a really good idea.
One other, this is Scott again, one other point there, I think, is that in the original, in the RFC 5050 era, when we were writing the BP specification that way, there was at that time, there was a strong sort of sentiment for non-layers thinking, and including capabilities inside the network protocol, essentially, rather than breaking it out into a separate layer. And so for that reason, including it all in one document. With BP-BIS, with Bundle Security Protocol, we sort of diverged from that a little bit in that BPSec is an extension of Bundle Protocol. It's still at the same layer, but it is a separate document. And this would be essentially doing the same thing with custody transfer. It's like splitting TCP and IP apart, except that they're still at the same layer and just in different documents.
Maybe it's like describing congestion control outside of the base TCP or something. Ronald, apologies for mispronouncing your name, Infelt, says, pulling out custody transfer into a separate document is fine with me. Up to now, I failed to understand how CT could ever be usefully combined with any multi-copy DTN routing strategy.
Which is exactly the point we came across yesterday.
Right.
So in fact, I think the way custody transfer is written in the BP spec right now, if you had multiple copies, the procedures would work. They might not work in the way that you want them to. And in particular, if you've got a forwarding node that fragments the bundle without taking custody of it, there would never be any custody acceptance signal going back on that original bundle, and it would just get retransmitted from the sender. So there are weird cases like that arguably should be addressed in the custody transfer specification.
Okay, so I think our intention is to post this question on the list just to give everyone an opportunity to answer there who can't make it here today, and that's where decisions are made. But we'd like a prompt decision on this so that Scott and the editorial team can start splitting out the document. And I seem to remember, Scott, you mentioned to me that your intention was to actually produce a rough first draft of the custody transfer with the bits you had cut out of the BP.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. You also mentioned to me that you would like assistance or perhaps somebody to act as the main editor on the custody transfer draft as you've got your hands full with BPBIS.
Well, I think that would be great. And also I'd like to get started on quality of service, and I haven't had time to do that. So if somebody else would pick up custody transfer, I think that'd be great.
Okay, so should we move on? You have a second slide deck.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Let me find it.
Right. And this is more informational than anything else. This is not really to raise a technical decision sort of issue. It's really just informative. These are slides provided by Marius Feldman at Technical University in Dresden. He and his guys have actually done an initial implementation of the current internet draft for BPBIS called, it's the newest version of their DTN suite, which is called MicroPCN. Oh, sorry, we've got a comment.
Yeah, just I think it's a useful interjection. So Keith says he's fine for now to follow up on the list and is willing to be the editor of a CT document.
Great, excellent. I think that's a perfect resolution.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's very kind.
In developing MicroPCN implementation of BPBIS, Marius and his guys did some performance analysis of processing times and bundle sizes, and these are just a couple slides of their findings. MicroPCN it's for very small platforms, Cortex microcontrollers. It includes BP6, and also now there's this BPBIS implementation. Neighbor discovery, a simple routing system it's really optimized for low Earth orbiting satellites. So what they've done is they've compared the BPv7 and BPv6 implementations with respect to parsing time and bundle sizes. Let's see if does this work? Sort of work? Yes. Okay. And first, this is bundle parsing time, and these are for different bundle sizes and indicating number of CPU cycles to do the parsing. The blue bars are RC5050, that's using the self-limiting numeric values approach that was built into RC5050. Then BPV7 using lib CBOR and BPV7 using tiny CBOR as parsing implementations. And it demonstrates that there is some additional overhead imposed by using CBOR on the order of 33 to 75% parsing overhead, depending on which library you use. This is just in parsing, of course. It's not like total bundle transmission throughput. It's just the parsing cycles in handling bundle. It demonstrates that the lib CBOR approach is significantly quicker than the tiny CBOR approach because it uses function pointers instead of explicit type checks for every field. So that's a recommendation for implementers to keep in mind. Okay. Bundle sizes, actually about the same. The RC50, the BP7 without CRCs is comes out slightly smaller than bundle sizes in RC5050. If you add the CRCs, it's about the same size. So there isn't any bundle size penalty imposed significantly by using CBOR. There's also no particular advantage. So it comes out to about a wash. And here's this is another chart on basically the same kinds of things.
That's the same slide.
That's why it's so similar. There was another.
Was that?
Change. Oh, okay, it's the same slide.
Yes,
Okay. Okay, so that is it. Any questions on this? Thanks.
Rick, as a personal comment, I'd be interested to see what Carsten Bormann's comment would be about the CBOR
Yeah,
parsing
absolutely.
time, because I know he's talked about assembly-based jump table implementations
Oh, yeah.
and so on, and I'm sure on the list he'll pile in with some comment.
There's lots of performance optimization, lots of room for performance optimization in BP anyway. That's there are guys in Glenn Research Center and a couple other places that are looking at this.
Stephen, can you go back to the slide 3, the timing one? So this doesn't say, was it RC5050, was that the ION implementation that he's comparing with?
No, this is the micro PCN implementation of RC5050. This is all done using their implementation.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay.
Did you have what's your concern?
No, I'm just kind of surprised that the time difference is so big. I mean, it just seems weird.
Well, again, this is just in parsing, right?
Right. So
And overall, it's a small part of the bundle processing cycle. This is not looking at like a big hit on throughput. The actual impact on throughput is not really measured here. It's just the parsing cycles.
okay.
And I think the point here is that SDMVs, yeah, everybody didn't like them, but they really are very fast.
Okay. So they, would it be unfair to summarize this as you're significantly slower in a tiny part of the code?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
Rick, again, I think thinking back on some of the arguments for CBOR back 2 years ago or whenever it was not just about parsing performance. It was more about the added flexibility for extension blocks, and it was a richer format than SDNV. So
yes, that and sort of just generally being better aligned with the way IETF works, right?
Yeah.
And with the ecosystem, the internet protocol ecosystem.
And if I'm going to be sort of computer science critical of the bars on this chart, the fact that tiny CBOR was slower than libcbor by a greater margin than libcbor was slower than the SDN-V parser. I'm not sure how good quality statistics these are or what this is trying to say, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Sure.
Fred Temple from Boeing again. I just was wondering, what are the implications of these performance comparisons? Are we worried about small size, weight, and power devices, or?
Like I say, I think this is just informational. I don't think we should change any sort of direction in anything we're doing because of this. It's a thing to keep in mind, and it's in sort of a, maybe it's a heads up when you go to do an implementation, and if the bundles are very small, so the processing time is a significant fraction of processing time, then you may see an impact and be puzzled how come that impact is there. And this is sort of a advanced warning that there may be some impact, and we're choosing to accept it.
Okay.
I think it's Rick again. I think that's a good point there, Scott. I mean, speaking from experience, I hand rolled my own CBOR parser because I wasn't that happy with the off-the-shelf ones, because they're kind of designed for a webby sort of world where. So I think you're right. This is a heads up for implementers that if you're dealing with small size, weight, and power, have a little look and profile your parser, because there's probably some tips and tricks that you can do. Okay.
Anything else?
I think that's it. Thanks, Scott. What do we do with BPBIS? Should we discuss that after the BPSec? Just because we were having a semi-private conversation in front of a mic there. Mark was asking me what we should do about the question that was raised in some of the BPBIS comments about whether BPBIS can go forward to the IESG once all comment reviews have been addressed, without or with BPSec. I think it was Stephen Farrell who raised the point that pushing forwards a transport protocol without any security document is probably going to fail. I'm looking at my responsible AD here for some guidance, which implies that BPSec probably should go into working group last call. The question really was, do we want to discuss that? Everyone's getting up, so let's discuss this now, and then we actually have a short presentation on BPSec coming. But
So Rand Atkinson, I have a end user perspective on this, and that is that they need to go together. And if they don't go together, I personally will object. And I'm pretty sure that the security ADs will support the objection.
Stephen Farrell, as a recovering security AD, yeah, I think that's good. However, I think all it needs time-wise is the BPSec to be a normative reference. If the working groups end one today and one in 6 months, that the ISG won't care. If it's a normative reference, then it means that the BPBIS spec will sit in the RFC editor queue waiting, and that's okay. So I think the significant question is whether BPBIS has to have BPSec as a normative reference and as a thing you have to do. If the working group don't send them the same day, that's okay.
okay, so let me rephrase the question. And obviously this will go to the list as well, but open for discussion. Does BPSec have to be a normative reference? Is the working group happy with having BPSec as a normative reference for BPBIS?
This is Scott Burley, and just saying that I'm certainly fine with having BPSec be a normative reference in BPBIS.
So Spencer Dawkins, the responsible AD, who the chairs were gazing at. I agree with what Stephen said about a normative reference probably being sufficient for IESG review. I will say that I would expect if the documents go forward together, it will be easier for people to review on the ISG and in the IETF for last call. It's like I say, to decide how badly they need to go forward together, because you all know the documents better than anybody else. But that's the one consideration I'd have is not getting a whole bunch of questions and objections during review of the base document that where you say, oh, you know, you need to look in this other document that we're still working on, which is a perfectly fine answer. But if you don't have to have, if you don't generate those questions, that probably goes quicker.
So, Ed?
As if by magic, BPSec updates.
Hi, my name is.
You need to be quite close to the mic. Sorry.
Hi, my name is. There's a dent in the mic. Someone's gotten too close. My name is Ed Barain. I'll be talking about BPSec, the security protocol for funding protocol. Okay, so this slide was from the last IETF, and it's up here to illustrate a point. At the last IETF, we talked about some general cleanup and syncing to the new version of BPBiz. We made a couple of additions based on technical recommendations. Most of them were to deal with considerations, not parts of the technical spec itself, but text that put things in perspective. We removed some legacy items and the idea of a CMS block, adding a section for other extension blocks in the consideration section. And then we really didn't have anything left to do other than address open questions and see what the next steps were. So that's where we were as of the last meeting. And really not much has changed. We went through the spec one more time in anticipation of this meeting. And most of the changes, all of the changes were editorial in nature, clarifying some of the considerations work. And then making sure that we were synchronized with the CBOR encodings for BPBiz. So my thought for this presentation, given that, was to walk through each of the sections of the document and just explain what has changed and what hasn't changed, and then open it up for any questions. In doing that, may I ask the question, who here has read the BPSec document, either this most recent one or any of the versions in the past year, because they really haven't changed that much in the past year? That's 2.5.
Okay,
3.
that's quite a low number of hands. This is going to turn into quite an important document by the sense in the room. Can I please request people get a chance to read this either on the plane home or at some point this week while it's still fresh in your mind? Thank you.
So it's not literature, but it is a good read. So if we were to go section by section, section 1, in the introduction, we have a motivation section to describe what it is we're trying to do with this particular security protocol. There have just been some general updates to that, minor rewordings. Really the major change here is we removed the text graphic of bundle nodes. It's repeated in BPBiz. It's actually sourced in BPBiz. It didn't add much to the conversation for this document, and consolidated some of the terminology, again, based on the fact that this is tightly coupled with BPBiz. Again, we have a key properties section to the document, which describes the kind of functions that we see as necessary in this security space. There were no technical changes to that, just some editorial cleanup. If we go into section 3, which is where we start talking about sort of the meat of the specification, we took some of the text that was convoluted and pulled them out into their own sections for clarity. We added a uniqueness section to discuss what a security operation is and how a security operation is required to be unique within a bundle to avoid processing confusion and ordering issues. We formalized the discussion of target multiplicity to discuss how a single security operation could target multiple blocks within a bundle under very specific circumstances, when they share a security source, when they share key information, when they're performing the same security service. And then at the end, we created a section specifically to how we identify those targets, which has become much more simple with BPBiz having a block number to uniquely identify blocks. And then generally we updated the section to track BP-BIS. So we added the fields for CRC type and CRC value when we discussed blocks and canonicalization forms. We updated the abstract security block to align with the CBOR encodings, and then we have a few slides on that in a moment. We then went through the abstract security block, finished the encodings there, updated the flag bit descriptions to match BP-BIS, and then in the BIB and DCB sections, there were some minor changes that describe those individual integrity and confidentiality blocks, mainly to point to tables for the block ID instead of hard coding them there, because obviously they're going to change, and pushing the table at the end seems better. And then in the parameter and results type, the only other significant change here is that in the previous versions of the spec, there was a single enumeration that covers both parameters and security results, because you can have different parameter types for CipherSuite parameters, and you can have different kinds of security results. And instead, we gave them separate enumeration spaces. So you could have parameter type 1, 2, and 3, and result type 1, 2, and 3. That seemed cleaner. And we gave CBOR encodings for each of those, and then added some discussion at the end to call them out for when we have to assign them. So for the CBOR encodings, we walked through how we would encode the abstract security block. This was largely based on looking through the BP-BIS document to see how BP-BIS was recommending CBOR encodings, and then to adopt that standard for BPSec. So things like the security targets, it's an array of unsigned integers, because you could have one or more security targets, and a security target is a block number, and a block number is a CBOR unsigned integer. The CipherSuite ID would be a CBOR unsigned integer. We went back and forth over whether we make the flags an unsigned integer or a byte itself, and an unsigned integer seemed a little more efficient, especially given the small number of flags that we have, which is 2, which would allow us to fit into a single byte. Then we would have security source, which points to the BP-BIS rules for EID representation. We don't feel the need to recreate that here. However, BP-BIS says we represent an endpoint identifier. That's how we would represent an endpoint identifier as a security source. And then on the CipherSuite parameters, we made that an array with each element in the array. And these parm1, parm2, parm3 type and value, that is a logical representation, not the actual representation of the CBOR array on the wire, but it is an array of tuples, right? Type and value, 1 for each parameter. So if we had 3 parameters that we wanted associated with the CipherSuite, then there would be an array with 3 elements. Each array would be a 2-tuple of the type and the value for that parameter. Parameter type, parameter value. Where type here identifies what the parameter is. I see someone getting up. I'll talk slowly.
It's Rick Taylor speaking personally. Did you not look at CBOR dictionaries for that? Because that seems to be a dictionary for your params.
It might, and I'm not against that. I went with how BP-BIS was encoding some of their tuples, and wanted to do whatever BP-BIS was doing. If there's a more efficient way of doing that, all open to it.
I think if you don't care about ordering, there's a sort of a dictionary with a slightly more efficient way of encoding, but
That's fine. If someone can take a note of that, I will go review that, and certainly we can update the CBOR encoding. Or review to see if we want to update the CBOR encoding. Then the other is.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So I had only previously scanned this document, and I just did again. I see that the string AES does not occur anywhere, nor does the string COSE, C-O-S-E. Why, don't you need one or both of those?
So so is that the question? Don't we need COSE or AES in the
Right. To get interoperability, you need to specify one way or another which are the mandatory implement algorithms.
So when we looked at BSP, one of the things that got us wrapped around the axle was the idea of having a single specification that talked about how we transported CipherSuite information, the policies associated with the security, and the individual descriptions of the CipherSuites and how you would configure them. And so what we had proposed for some time was to try and break those into 3 separate areas. Having BPSec be agnostic of the individual CipherSuite, since this is how, once a CipherSuite is generated, it's CipherSuite information, whether it's authentication tags or ciphertext or integrity signatures or so on. This is how you would wrap and carry them in the bundle, with the idea that there would be a series of CipherSuites that say this is how you create a cipher suite for something like AES or BPSec.
Right.
Wait,
But you did one.
Microphone, please.
So yeah.
That's great, as far as it goes. Somewhere there needs to be a spec for an example cipher suite that becomes the mandatory to implement. Where is that?
so there is a Suite B profile
Okay.
for BPSec.
Okay, so
that was-
A, that's probably too heavyweight for some people. Okay, I get that there is a community for that, no objection to it, but that's probably too heavyweight for some people. I didn't find the document when I looked for it. So what's the draft that has that?
There were two internet drafts that dealt with that. They've probably expired at this point.
Which
why
is
we can't
maybe
find
why I can't find them.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great, but we probably need an internet draft or an appendix to this document, either one. Internet draft, I think modularly is cleaner. That specs something that's a little bit less heavyweight than Suite B. And then maybe resurrect the Suite B and make sure it maps back to the latest version of this spec. And then you've got two specs, one of which is lighter weight and mandatory to implement, one of which is heavier weight and optional. And you've demonstrated to the IETF security weenies that in fact, what you have is algorithm independent or mode independent, and that's a win-win, right? So I think there's a path forward. I just think you actually have to have those documents.
So that I agree with all of that, and having an example cipher suite document is good and part of sort of the overarching plan. The question that I have is mandatory. And so perhaps we could have some more discussion on whether or not the core BPSec spec says all devices must implement 128-bit AES. And what does that mean for devices that don't want to do that and still have security?
Stephen Farrell. So first thing, Suite B is a fine thing for people based in one country. Well, you know what I mean. Like, not for every country.
It's for a user community.
Sure.
And it's not even.
Microphone, please, guys.
Any of those countries.
Microphone, please.
So Suite B is a national specification, and it's not, although used more broadly, it's not an acceptable.
Well, that's not the issue.
Your name.
Rand Atkinson. So that's not the issue. Suite B is used in multiple countries by multiple parties, but it's only used by a user community that has a particular threat model, which might not be a mainstream threat model. And that's the actual problem with Suite B. What's needed is something that is more commercially viable and sensitive to the fact that some of these things might be running on an ARM and they don't have a lot of CPU. But the reason you have a pick one, I don't know what it is, but a pick one mandatory security is so that you can interoperate, right? That's an interoperability functional technical requirement to have one. Now, it doesn't have to be the strongest one. RC4 with 40-bit keys won't get past the security area, but it doesn't have to be wacko, complicated, computationally complex. And, having both specs is great, but the lighter weight one is probably what you want.
So I agree with all that. That's also a problem for Suite B. But I also agree that what you want is a relatively lightweight thing, and it's not rocket science to define how to use AES and some kind of Diffie-Hellman. That's fairly straightforward. Or look at what the COSE working group have done, which I think So I think whatever you find in typical CBOR/COSE implementations, and talk to Jim Shad, and he has one, would I think be the right thing to just add in here as here's how you get interoperability.
Stephen, can I request you introduce some of us? I have had no contact with anyone in
Sure.
COSE about this, and it looks like you're suggesting there's some opportunities for learning and cross-pollination. So
Yeah, I
it's
think
probably worth us reaching out to them, because I'm not sure anyone from COSE is here. If you attended COSE or deal in COSE, can you put your hand up?
Oh, I think is it closed? I can't remember. It's done.
Oh, it's done, is it? Okay.
I think so. I can't remember. Yeah, Jim Shad is the person you want. Now, as to mandatory to implement, so BPSec is not mandatory for nodes. So the BPSec implementation is not a mandatory feature of a DTN node.
That's correct.
Right? For me, the consequence is that it's entirely reasonable to say that mandatory to implement thing, if you do BPSec, is AES and some kind of elliptic curve if you haven't. Because not all DTN nodes need to do it already.
So we can certainly do that. We can certainly generate a lightweight integrity suite and a lightweight confidentiality suite, and say these are the lowest common denominator for interoperability. The pushback we will get, but that may not be motivating pushback, is simply that there are some folks for which it is not what they want to do, and why would they carry the extra implementation that they know they're not going to use. But that's not a reason not to put it into the spec. It's just a part of the rationale.
So yeah, but you can still implement a DTN node and not do any of this.
Correct.
So therefore, the fact that we have an RFC that says, here's BPSec, and if you do this, then do that algorithm suite, is fine for them.
Well, in addition, the spec itself describes that you can have other security blocks, not BIB and BCB, that can be defined in other documents, and this was part of the CMS discussion. So perhaps when we talk about a mandatory security suite, we say if you are doing BIB, then you must implement this common denominator integrity cipher suite, and if you are doing BCB, here's another common denominator, and if someone needs something radically different, then they can create another security block, and say a characteristic of security blocks is that they have a minimum implementation for compatibility.
So, Scott Burnley, on the mandatory issue here is, my understanding of what you were saying was that there might be some users who would want BPSec and would not want they would want a security, they would want a cipher suite like Suite B, and they would not want additionally to have to carry the lightweight implementation that they don't plan to use and have to carry it simply because it's mandatory. And I just wanted to offer that clarification.
Thank you. Yeah, if we looked at the original BSP, for example, one of the mandatory integrity suites was HMAC SHA-1, and that's great from a common denominator, everyone understands it, but hopefully no one is practically using that operationally, especially not given the past couple of months.
The past couple of months did not affect HMAC SHA-1.
Just SHA-1.
Yeah, so the BPSec will end up as RFC 9 million or something, right? If you implement RFC 9 million, then supporting AES and curve 25519 person, whatever it happens to be, is just fine. If you want RFC 10 million, that is Suite B, then that will say what you have to implement. And it's entirely fine to have a bundle node that does BP base, which is like RFC 8 million, and 10 million.
Well, just a question back. If we instead of saying BPSec RFC 9 million, if we said BIB block type 9 million, you must do this cipher suite spec, and BCB block type 9 million plus 1 must do this confidentiality suite, that is perhaps the same technical outcome that what you're talking about, but then it talks about tying a cipher suite to a security block type as opposed to a cipher suite to an overall specification, which I think would be a cleaner map.
I'm not sure that we want to require that every
Your name.
Rand Atkinson. I note that I am the only one who gets asked that, and that when Stephen says something, he doesn't get asked to repeat his name.
Noted.
I'm sorry.
I have in fact introduced myself 5 times.
No, it's because for people when the
Okay, that's fine. Ask Stephen and everyone else and be consistent.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm not worried about what the Suite B community does. I'm sure they're perfectly happy implementing Suite B, and if their security policy says, yea, verily, we must not implement this other thing, they'll just not implement it. And within the community of people who want to talk Suite B, that might be a completely valid way to go. I mean, if you believe the public internet, in the world, there exist devices that only talk Suite B, regardless of what the IETF says, for IPsec. And they're apparently pretty widespread, you know, on 4 continents. So that community, I don't think, is going to freak out over a must-implement suite that's lighter weight than Suite B.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Then the question is, if these are mandatory, is there a working group preference as to whether we would put them as an appendix to BPSec or have them as individual documents?
I don't have a strong preference. My observation from watching this for 30 years is that all cryptologic specifications have shorter lifetimes than cryptologic protocol specifications. And so if you put them in a separate document, then it's easier to move that chunk to historic, and that can be done, you know, in an IANA registry pretty easily. Whereas if what you're doing is moving Appendix X to historic, but you're keeping the base specification, that ends up being confusing to an implementer who gets handed an RFC or told to go implement an RFC 5 years from now in some random location, who doesn't read the meeting minutes and is not here. So I would suggest modular wins, but it's not a strong preference.
May I then, agreed, may I then pose another question? I don't know if it's allowed to go, is it a two-way conversation?
We have time, so why not?
So one of the things that we have here is the Cipher Suite ID. And the concept behind that is that there would be a registry of Cipher Suites. This would be moderated. In the BPSec document, would it be a good idea to say that the mandatory implementation for BIB is Cipher Suite ID 1, and the mandatory implementation for BCB is Cipher Suite ID 2, and then in a separate registry, we handle how that maps to a specific Cipher Suite implementation to change later.
Steam file.
That's a bad idea. Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's a bad idea. Yeah, handling the references is fine. Like Rand said, I mean, whether you make it the mandatory, the MTI Cipher Suites can be a separate document or in here. It's not a huge difference. It is a little bit more modular to have it as a separate document, but then there's more overhead and it's a bit harder to understand for some people, but it does work out better over time. And, you know, I think the other thing I'd say is that, you know, we could kind of debate endlessly what exactly those Cipher Suites should be. I would suggest just looking at what's available in implementations and pick that.
Yeah.
And it may be, I can't remember, but I think there may be like a, you know, there may be a curve 25519 thing, or there might be a list curve thing. Just pick that. Even if it's, you know, even if you could possibly get simpler, just picking what's available in code is probably the right thing here.
Rick speaking personally, I'd like to see the base BPSec document saying, requesting from IANA a registry for Cipher Suites, and then an accompanying document that comes through at the same time saying current best practice for interoperability or lowest common denominator for interoperability is, and as Stephen suggested, cherry picked off whatever COSI are recommending, or, you know, what the sort of best common practice in inverted commas amongst IETF to say, here is a Cipher Suite that goes into the registry and can, as Rand said, can be deprecated in 3 years' time when someone finds a gaping hole in it.
So, agreed, and creating a profile for such Cipher Suites, and perhaps creating a new document that says BPSec baseline interoperability suites or something like that. That's a 6 or 8 page document.
Yeah.
It will come together very quickly.
Ran Atkinson, the other observation I would make is that whatever Suite B says now, and I don't know what it says, but whatever it says now, it's going to say something different in 5 years. So it's probably not going to actually be labeled or whatever as Suite B. It's probably going to be this cipher, this key strength, this mode, this integrity algorithm, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it may be that 10 years from now, we're all using, you know, then what Suite B is today. I don't know that that's the case, but it's a possible outcome. So we don't want to name it in terms of it's Suite B or it's not Suite B. We want to just think about it as a suite of algorithms that people can use. And the Suite B guys, they'll figure out which one is Suite B, and that's not our problem.
And also, Rand, we don't get to define Suite B. That's defined by the Suite B SDO, effectively.
Okay. So from here, the only other part of encoding was the security result. The security result is patterned, again, similarly to parameters, where you can have a few security results, the main results, some additional authentication tags, things like that. Whatever the outputs of the Cypher suite are, the only difference with the result types is that we group them by target, and this is part of target multiplicity. If you have a few blocks in a bundle that all have the same security source, that all have the same key information, then you could have a single security service target multiple security blocks, and then you would have Cypher suite results per target. And this is also affected by Rick's comment of, would it be more efficient to represent this as a CBOR dictionary? For parameter types, these are the parameter Cypher suite parameter types that we have identified so far: initialization vector, key information, content range, and salt. We have a reserved range 4 to 31, and we have an unassigned range. And the 4 to 31 from a CBOR unsigned in is just to try and make sure that we've reserved everything that keeps our table to 1 byte.
Rand Atkinson, I have an educational question, as in I don't follow. For the ID, it's a byte string. For the salt, which is described on the slide as an ID-like value, we are using a byte array. And that looks like either an accident or there's something that's not documented in the document that makes byte array more suitable in one case and byte string more suitable in the other.
I can't defend byte array. It may be a typo. I'd have to go look.
And I think the CBOR encoding of both is identical, apart from a tag bit that says this is an array rather than a string. I think there's still length and bytes. But I agree with your question, Ren.
Hi, Stephen Powell. So COSE is the how do you do crypto with CBOR spec, which is in the RFC editor queue right now. We should be using that and not redefining things like IVs, which I think are in that document.
Okay.
So if this does not, so fair enough. If there's a separate or better encoding and representation and internal structure to an IV, which means always just in a large number, or is it the fact that should BPSec say we enumerate parameter type 0 to be the initialization vector? Because part of this is the encoding itself, but part of it is just how we enumerate that when we talk about it in a BPSec security block.
So I think that if you're using COSE, you say we're using we want a MAC or we want an encrypted block, and the details of IVs or whatever are inside that.
So again, we'll look through the COSE spec.
Right. So but I think the decision point is: are we going to redefine the crypto, or are we going to use COSE?
So preference is if there's already something that captures this kind of information and is targeted for CBOR, we should reuse that and not reinvent something else.
So Rand Atkinson, so I would say that what would help is if Stephen would post the pointer to the COSE document on the list, and then everybody knows where to go look, because I believe him, but I have no idea where to go look. And then what I would do is go look at what they have and see if all the things above that we think we need here can somehow be mapped in. And if they can, then we just recycle technology, because recycling is best.
It's draft IETF COSE MSG for message, and I just posted the link into the Jabber, and I'll send it to the list here.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was Stephen Farrell.
Same comment and same results for the result type enumeration table. In terms of the canonical forms, we walk through the primary block canonicalization algorithm. BPSec defines that because we do allow an integrity signature that targets the primary block. So we updated that for the BPBiz format and BPBiz CBOR encoding. Currently, our thought was to mask out the bundle is fragment, not bundle if fragment. And custody transfer requested for this bundle. A question coming out of this is if we were to canonicalize the primary block, is it appropriate with our current thinking on custody transfer to mask that bit in the primary block? And perhaps we can't answer that question until we understand some of the mechanics around custody transfer. For non-primary block canonicalization, we follow the BPBiz rules for that, with a few exceptions. When we create a confidentiality set of ciphertext that targets the block's specific field, the block type's specific data field in the extension block, not everything. So we are not currently encrypting the block type code or block number or processing control flags. There had been some discussion as to whether we wanted the BCBs to fully encapsulate the target block or simply to replace their plaintext payload with ciphertext payload. And the decision that we had made, at least for the BCB block type, was to replace the plaintext payload with ciphertext payload.
Rick Taylor, personally, this is a clarification question on my behalf. Going back to the primary block canonicalization, sorry. Given the primary block is immutable, why mask out the flags before encrypting?
So we tried to look at bits that may change.
But if they're immutable, they can't change.
Well, that's a fair point. So if they are immutable and they cannot change, then we don't need to mask anything. Sorry?
I'm asking Scott, who stood behind me. Are the flags in the primary block are immutable because the primary block is immutable? Is that right?
Okay.
So what the entire primary block is supposed to be immutable. So the the thing that concerned me here was custody transfer requested for this bundle. I don't know why that would be different. Even if you did fragmentation, that ought to be the same all the way along. So I don't understand why that would be masked out. Bundle is fragment. I can understand maybe what you're going for there, but you would not have a BCB for the primary block anyway. You would have a bib for the primary block. If you fragmented, you would create a new bib for the primary block, right? I would think, because there are fields in the primary block that are identifying for the fragment. And so for that reason, I think you would not need to mask out the bundle as fragment flag either.
I think you're probably right. This language was probably preserved from when this was SBSP for RC5050.
Okay.
And it's no longer applicable with BPBs.
So I guess I'm inclined to suggest that masking out the bits we might not need in this specification. I'm sort of agreeing with what Rick was saying.
I agree. The only other change to non-primary block canonicalization is that you may apply the cipher suite to a subset of the block payload as opposed to all of the block payload. For the other sections, there were minor changes in the areas for security processing, queue management, and so on.
Stephen, can you just go back one? So the question I'd like to think about a bit is applying the cipher suite to part but not all of the bundle. And I guess what's in my head is that really useful, and will anyone ever do it? And I think experience tends to tell us that people either protect things fully or not at all. And also for receivers, if you have a bundle that has some fields, let's say, integrity protected and others not, that means that you need to percolate that information of all of the code that decides whether to action those particular bits of the bundle. So I wonder, is it wiser to say, do the whole thing?
Rick Taylor, can I just chip in at this point? I have use cases, because I'm looking at some routing problems, where the ability to sign reverse path information on as extension blocks as they pass along the path to the destination for report reverse pathing, the ability to avoid the chance of the problems with source-based routing and malicious entities along the path injecting arbitrary information and affecting the reverse path. The ability to just sign that and say, I don't care about anyone reading my data as it goes across, but what I want to make sure is nobody is maliciously interfering with path information I'm learning in my intermediate hops. And that's where putting an integrity check on just a part of the entire bundle is useful. But I'm willing to be told that's a stupid thing to do.
Stephen Barrell? No, it's not stupid, except it is. So if you did, I mean, it's easy to, excuse me, it's relatively easy to come up with reasons to want it. Right. But if you get it, every receiver has to percolate the information up as to exactly which bits of the bundle were protected how, if they're going to react any differently to the integrity protected stuff or the non-integrity protected stuff. And that's really hard to do. So, it kind of it makes sense in a spec, and it makes sense if you draw little pictures and whiteboards. But when you get into the receiver code, if I have to react differently, it's like really hard to implement. To percolate up all the information about the map of what was protected by whom, from where to who to what to what, all the way up to the code that has to react to the content. So it screws your APIs basically.
Well, a question about that. If you have and perhaps this is a simple view of how that exchange would work, but if you have a bib that targets a subset of some other block, it's the BPSec processing at the DPA which would verify that particular piece. And so the higher order applications would know that the data, the path in this example, were passed up as being validated, and they themselves would not have the information that only a subset of that was validated. What they would understand is at the destination or at the waypoint node that processed the bib, when they processed the bib, they verified that signature for that subset, and that's what passed. Is that so? I don't. In that scenario, is that acceptable? That the applications just know that it passed or failed its integrity check?
So I think
State your name, please.
Sorry, Stephen Crow. What it seems relatively simple, and it is simple to write the spec, and it's simple to draw the pictures of bundles with multiple MACs and all that kind of stuff. In the receiver code, it gets kind of mad stupid, because if you have if you want to modularize your code to say passes integrity, fails integrity, then there's not much better you can do than fails integrity, just throw the whole thing away. Passing up to the higher level code that this particular extension block was okay, and that one I don't know, is like nearly impossible. So therefore, the higher level code can never know if something was or wasn't protected. Now, I mean, like I said, it's you can specify it, and you can definitely invent use cases. But I really wonder, is it wise? Like protecting everything or nothing seems like simpler.
So that's a hard question to answer. If we look at confidentiality on the payload, I do know there are cases where the payload itself is an aggregate of other payloads, and you could protect all of it, or you could protect pieces of it. So there are use cases where people want to do it, but you ask the question, do people want to use it? And the second question, is it wise? So I can't answer the second question, is it wise? But I do know that there are use cases for wanting to do that.
Sorry, I thought we were here to be wise, no?
Scott Burley, I think I see Stephen's point that we want to encourage people to do things that are foolish. At the same time, my sense is that if we can write the specification in such a way that people can do these weird things and not require that they do these weird things, that if the specification is comprehensive and addresses lots of possible cases, and people only use one or two of them, I don't see that as being harmful, and I think it would make it more broadly usable in lots of different deployment environments. I think we shouldn't try to. I think it's best not to try to anticipate too far in advance how people are going to use something. I think it's better to provide the tools and let people decide.
Stephen Farrell again. No, I disagree with that, because it's a dangerous implement when you give somebody a half-protected PDU in any protocol, right? So I don't think the right approach here is to say what we want to do is we're defining a mandatory to implement Cypher suite. I think the right thing to do is to make it simple, easy to implement, more likely to be implemented, and so that the processing code, particularly on the receiver side, is less complex. And I think that means Like protect the whole thing or nothing with this MTI cipher suite is, I think, the thing to do. Whether the abstract block allows lots of weird cases, I don't really care too much. But unused code is where bugs are found and where vulnerabilities arise. So, like defining less, I think, is better.
Rick, I'm going to jump in there with the counter argument. The difference between what you say makes perfect sense in a fully connected network, you know, where but we're in DTN where bundles rest and are handed off from node to node along the way, and the intermediate nodes may want to attach extension blocks halfway along the path that need to be authenticated as they're stripped off or dealt with along the way. The source and the destination of the bundle may be low power little lossy devices traveling through a big, thick, rich network, which has a lot of crypto involved in it, not worrying about payload encryption, but authentication about the extra blocks that are being put on and taken off. So I think our environment is more complicated than this. And
Just a moment to respond to that is, in the spec, a bib would target other extension blocks. So you could, if you add block 1, you could protect block 1.
Yeah.
And when you go to process block 1, you would process the integrity signature of block 1. You do get that block level of granularity as part of the spec. That's one of the key properties in the security spec. The question is, when you're looking at block 1, do you say, I have 100 bytes of payload for block 1? Not to be confused with the payload block, but 100 bytes of my user data in block 1. Do I integrity sign all 100 bytes, or do I say the first 15 bytes are not integrity signed and the remainder is integrity signed? Are you doing the entire user data in the block or not? There are cases where people come back and say, because that user data is aggregated in some way, we want some in clear and some in cipher, but you know, I'm willing to do whatever the working group thinks is best.
Ryan Atkinson. I'm not sure what I think. I'm very sympathetic to Stephen's comments. I think as an implementer, it would be extraordinarily difficult to puzzle out if you had a bundle payload that was partially protected. It would be very difficult on the receive side to puzzle out how to handle that. And so I think that's a legitimate issue. I'm wondering whether the conversation might focus better if there were a short internet draft that talked about specific use cases where not signing everything made sense. And it sounds like that a couple of people have them. I'm wondering if maybe just putting out some use cases on the list or putting out a really short internet draft and say, I have this use case, might focus the discussion.
Stephen Farr, just echoing Keith Scott from Jabber. He says, but with bib and BCB, you get the ability to protect individual blocks. So yes, I think Stephen's notion is to protect all or none of a block, but you don't have to authenticate whole bundles.
Rick Taylor quickly. Yeah, I think I confused the issue by confusing encrypting part of an individual block as compared to bundle. I think I swapped the word bundle and block in my mind. Sorry.
So, Scott, that maybe bears on my comment then, because I'm actually all for doing an all or nothing sort of encryption on any single block, on the content of any single block. What I thought I was hearing that I thought was not going to be a good idea would be applying the same cipher suite to all blocks of a bundle or to none of them, which I think is not a good idea.
So if the rough consensus is that we won't do a content range, we can certainly take that to the list and remove it. There are use cases where it is necessary. However, it's something that perhaps could be done as part of a special cipher suite for those that need to do it that way.
I'll try pressing the button.
If I press this button, you will press that button.
Yeah.
So in remaining, there is a security processing section. There were no changes to that other than spell checks and grammar and things of that nature. The key management section, there were no changes to it, but it is because it is very short. The BPSec does not mandate an algorithm for key management or key exchange. In some of our discussions understanding how to do key management in very challenged environments is an open research area. If we look at, was it BCP 107, then there is some language in there that also describes some default-based pre-shared or pre-configured keys as a bootstrapping mechanism, which we would recommend as a default. But otherwise, there is no key management algorithm encoded in BPSec. We do have policy considerations, which are for creating the security policy associated with nodes, and these are things that nodes should make decisions on when they implement and when they architect their networks. Security considerations in general, which discuss the rock threat model associated with BPSec and what we can and cannot do if we encode security services into a bundle on the wire. You can't protect and trust everything that comes in on the wire. And then we have a discussion on if other security blocks are desired, such as a CMS block or some other kind of block, such as a confidentiality block that fully encapsulates its target. There is a mechanism to do that, but we don't have to hold up BPSec in order to extend it with other security extension blocks. And if you are to create other documents that describe other kinds of security extension blocks, this is how you should do it to maintain interoperability. And then finally, Section 9, which is a little bit out of order here, was Cipher Suite authorship considerations. So there's a section that says if you are writing Cipher Suites to be conformant with BPSec, here are the things that you should do. That hasn't changed in any significant way other than we added the guidance that Cipher Suites should consider as necessary to add their own Cipher Suite parameter types, result types, and canonicalization algorithms if necessary, and that if they do add their own types, they need to specify the CBOR encodings on those types. And we removed some of the work out of the IANA consideration section, and I would just ask for some guidance on how to best represent the need for certain registries in that section of the document.
Mark Lear. So IANA consideration section is actually not complete, but let's stabilize the document for all the things we've been discussing, and then we can, it's kind of more basic stuff of defining policies and stuff. So, we could do it now, but we can do it, mostly at the end where we're ready to as well.
So those are, thank you. Those are the presentations that I have here. What I've taken as actions, I certainly hope someone wrote some of this down, was to look back and revisit a couple of things. One, the primary block canonicalization algorithm does not need to mask any bits. That's a good catch. The other is that we are entertaining removing the content range and either passing the entire payload to the Cipher Suite and
The type block.
the entire block payload to the Cipher Suite, and then letting the Cipher Suite itself determine whether it operates on the entire block payload or a subset.
Rick here, can I just request, because I've got baffled on this at least once, can we try and avoid using the word block payload and say block content or some other word, because payload in my mind is the payload block, and I just get baffled otherwise.
Yeah, no, we can certainly do that. So those are the two changes from a spec perspective. And then we had also discussed creating a separate document that would be a Cipher Suite profile of two common interoperable Cipher Suites, updated to describe how they would work with BPSec so that we would have interoperability. And then the concept is if we made those changes and we create this other internet draft to tie together with BPSec, they should go forward together. I think that was my listing of the action items.
And looking at COSI.
And looking at those.
Looking at COSI. So Rick, with my chair hat on, following on from the earlier discussion after the, BPBIS and BPSec moving together as normative references or heading towards the IESG with normative references, I don't think we're ready for last call on this document because we've just, it's just enumerated a long list of changes that need to happen. But can I request that the working group look at this hard and try and keep the pace on these changes pretty quick so we can get some good comments? I don't really want to be asking, one comment by Prague would just be embarrassing for everyone involved. We have to keep the pace going on these important early drafts. So, because I know there's implementers out there waiting for us to get this stuff done, and we can't just keep this working group going forever on 3 documents. So my opinion, and if people disagree with me, get it on the list or you'll go to the mic, but we're not ready for working group last call yet, but I'd like us to get ready for it with BPSec.
Scott Burley, yeah, I agree with that. I think we're not ready right now, but I think if we are not ready by Prague, then we've got a big problem. I think we should be ready by Prague.
And that's not just Ed's to do. This is a group effort, guys, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. I've forgotten the agenda. Is it Brian Cephas now, or is it AMA next? Yeah, it's Brian.
Brian, are you here?
Hello?
Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay. Do I have control of the slides or no?
Can you see
I
the
see it.
slides? Just
Okay.
shout next slide for me.
Okay, so next slide.
Oh.
There's
Okay.
very few slides here and very many question marks relative to the number of slides. So no change has been made to the TCPCL draft since the last presentation, I believe. The last edits were made prior to the last IETF, but there were some comments that had come on mailing list. So I'm just going to basically go through those comments and throw questions out for discussion right now. So next slide, please. I kept in these next two slides unchanged since the earlier presentations. That the motivations were very few to update the TCPCL, but the major one was to include some capability for TLS, and the other one was to reduce sequencing variability, to simplify the protocol. Next slide, please. So even the current draft and the changes that we'll be talking about right now don't change the scope and the workflow of the original TCPCL. The variability has changed in that what was optional is now mandatory in most cases, but it still follows the same contact workflow, the same messaging workflow, and the same shutdown workflow. And there's some discussion a bit later on it, but it also reuses the same message type codes and reason codes. So next slide, please. The last questions that came off the mailing list, and I believe that these may have all been due to Rick Taylor's comments, is the first, and to me the biggest one, is should TLS be made mandatory in V4 of the TCPCL? My own personal feelings of this is that it probably should, and there's a couple of slides later on discussing this. The next comments are about reusing the message type and reason codes off of TCPCL V3 versus creating new registries for new codes just for V4. There was a comment / question about extensibility off of the CL protocol, and a question about neighbor discovery. My last own comment is there still are a few nits in the draft ID that just have not been updated. I was waiting on actually making content changes to take care of any of these nits. So next slide, please. We'll go through the question areas in the next 3 or 4 slides. So TLS and convergence layers. My own use of the TCP/CL and motivation for updating it to version 4 was that TLS would be used for the CL in a terrestrial WAN network. So the comment that was discussed on a mailing list was that if an individual set of users in their own private network decided that they would throw out TLS and ignore that section of the spec, then they're perfectly free to do so. But I'm absolutely fine with making TLS a mandatory part of the CL spec. And we can,
Brian, we
yeah,
got
go
a
ahead. We
question.
can talk about this now.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So I have more than one question. Are we talking, just to make sure I'm getting the right message, so we're talking about making the convergence layer only defined and running TLS?
Yes,
Is that
so
correct?
as it's written right now in the last draft, there's a connection upgrade procedure that is optional. In the current draft as it's written, either side of if both sides of the connection allow TLS, then there's effectively a start TLS sequence that upgrades an insecure connection to a secure connection. And this, if TLS would become mandatory, there simply would be no negotiation of that fact. It would be right after the initial handshake and magic string detection that tells that it is in fact TCP/CL v4, there would just be simply the start of a TLS session, unconditionally.
Great, which I would support that. I think that's a good idea.
And oh, go ahead.
So follow on is, two questions, I guess. One is, so if we're talking about using TLS 1.2, the current version, do we want to, are we looking at using anonymous Diffie-Hellman type things, or do we want to have only authenticated nodes, and if so, is it mutually authenticated on both sides?
Right now, as far as what's written in the spec, it does call out TLS 1.2, and I believe it does call out one of the BCPs that define a minimum mandatory cipher suite, but beyond that, the TCP/CL spec itself doesn't give any additional requirements or guidance beyond the existing BCP about using TLS itself.
Yeah. So I think so I think there's a couple of things you could do, right? So you could have allow anonymous Diffie-Hellman cipher suites and then have less configuration, or you could have a server authenticated one, so you know you're sending your packets to the right thing. For this protocol, I think you may as well go mutual authenticated if you're going to configure anything. So I'm not sure the server authenticated one as we use in the web is particularly useful in DTN. And support for anonymous cipher suites is not particularly great in libraries and so on. So I think you might be heading towards a mutually authenticated TLS here, which is quite doable in a you know, if you only got a small number of nodes and you know who you're talking to, that's not too hard. So it might be acceptable here where it's not in the web. So that's what. So I think mutually authenticated TLS, which is beyond the UTA BCP document, might make sense here.
Rick Taylor, just from my perspective, I can see updates to the use of TLS with TCP/CL coming out as documents to say, okay, we'll start with mutual authentication, and then someone may say, well, do you know what, I want to use anonymous Diffie-Hellman or whatever, some sort of ephemeral keying, however, and bring that in as a later document. So perhaps there is a need within the TCP/CL handshake, whether it's, I don't know whether there's some handshake in the clear before the TLS session starts or whether it should just go straight to the TLS session. There may need to be some discussion about this. I'm looking at you as this far more superior security expert from me for some sort of guidance on this.
But I guess if you know, as on the slide, if there's no reason for any plain text on the wire, then just start with the client hello.
Yeah.
And the current CL spec simply leaves it up to the policy of the endpoints to decide what additional TLS specific parameters are acceptable or required. That's how it's written right now.
Rand Atkinson. So I sent a late note to the list just before the meeting started, and I'm more articulate maybe in that note than I'm going to be at the mic. So when you get a chance later, it might be worth reading the note. The first bullet on the slide, as phrased, is confusing to me in an IETF context, because the IETF distinguishes between mandatory to implement and mandatory to use operationally. And the 30-year-old perspective that the IETF has is that security should always be mandatory to implement, so that if a user wants to use it, the user is able to use it in an interoperable way. And I fully support that. But the other piece to the IETF practice of the last 30 years is that it is optional whether the user actually uses it based on their local circumstances. And I also support that. So I support the idea of TLS being mandatory to implement, but I would object to TLS being mandatory to use. And I ought to be able to use TLS for some sessions and not use TLS for other sessions based on whatever my local policy is.
So the last, as you described it,
So Steve Farrell, and
the mandatory to implement, optional to use is how the TCP/CL draft as written today operates. There is a negotiation at the start of connection, a negotiation in plain text that only if both sides present themselves as allowing the use of TLS does the actual TLS session begin. If either side rejects the use of TLS and both allow the use of non-TLS, then the entire CL connection can be plain non-TLS. That's how it's written today.
So Stephen Farrell, so I agree with Ran about the 30-year perspective. However, I think also 30 years has passed. And we have a counterexample, which is WebRTC, where you may have to use DTLS. It's not an optional thing to use. It's there always. How you key it is another question, but it's there. And I think that would be okay here too. And I'd also point out that if you don't want to use TLS, you can use a different convergence layer in this case. So we're not saying that the only way to use the bundle protocol is over TLS. We're saying that for the TCP convergence layer version 4, it has to be TLS. So I think that's also acceptable. So I think while the mandatory to implement but not mandatory to use has been the IETF practice, and we don't have IETF generic consensus for anything stronger, we do have the WebRTC example, where in a new protocol, in a new context, people were saying that, and we have the Quick example, where I guess they're not going to end up, Spencer can talk about this, I guess. But I don't think Quick will end up being usable without TLS, Spencer, is that correct? Spencer? Right, so I think Quick will also require TLS to be used. Yeah, so
I think so.
So we have, I think we have modern practice, which is going beyond what we've done for many years, which is the mandatory implement, not use. And I think doing it here, I would argue for, maybe there will be objections and it should be discussed.
Rick Taylor speaking personally. I'm for TCP/CL version 4. I think mandatory TLS at the start. After the TCP session is up, you go straight into TLS, and that's it. If you want to use, inside your own data center, strange place for it. If you don't want TLS, go use TCP/L v3 or roll your own. We can't prevent you from just not doing the TLS.
What you do is you prevent interoperability where local policy might suggest that some sessions using the TCP convergence layer need security and other sessions do not. And so what that outcome would lead to is non-interoperability. You'd basically have to have a completely separate implementation and you'd have to have both implementations on the host. And then what you'd have to do is say, oh, so for this session, I'm going to go do, for this endpoint, I'm going to invoke that instance of TCP/CL inside my host. And oh, for this other session, I'm going to invoke the alternate instance of TCP/CL inside the host. And what that leads to is just non-interoperability, and that's not a good outcome.
So Stephen Farrell, I think that's correct. However, I think the practicality today of making TLS the way you get interoperability turns out to be quite doable, way more easily doable than it was 5 or 10 years ago, but it's quite doable in lots of all the toolkits we were talking about. And there's a plus side is that you can end up, I don't know if it affects DTN so much, but you can end up with better interoperability because middle boxes can't screw around with your stuff. Now, I don't know if that really is important for DTN here. Probably not. But while I think Ran is correct, there are counter arguments, which I would make.
And Rick, again speaking personally, because I'm too lazy to walk to the other microphone. The question, as I see it, is where do people see TCP/CL being used? Is it a convenient TCP-based CL to use within your satellite ground station, or are we intending to use this to interoperate across the public internet? And those two use cases, one, interoperate across the public internet. I think best practice is it's TLS from start to finish to stop the middle box problem. Current practice TLS is we go TLS, but I understand that if it's inside your ground segment, and it's NASA's or it's ESA's or it's whoever's ground segment, and it's externally controlled, then why do I need TLS? And I totally understand your argument.
So Rand Atkinson, so the thing is that I may actually have the bundle implementation and the TCP/CL inside a very small device, and that small device might be at different times connected in different ways, and it might at times go through the public internet, at other times it might not. And one of the issues is that in some cases at least, bundle is going to be used over bandwidth constrained lossy networks. And it might be that one would have a deployment where sessions might use the bundle security protocol to protect the data end to end, at which point the TCP/CL encryption underneath it is not adding any value to me. And it's not even protecting me against somebody sending me a forged TCP reset. And so I don't buy this. And basically it would force me to have two TCP/CL implementations inside my Raspberry Pi that's already bandwidth and resource constrained.
Well, also one thing to keep in mind is as written,
So again,
even if the TCPL session were initialized, the handshake were started, there's nothing preventing in the spec or in the implementation, nothing preventing the use of a trivial null cipher suite or something like that, that you just wanted to do the right job at the letter of the law, but not actually provide any authentication or confidentiality.
So Stephen Farrell, and again, I think Ran is correct, but there are counter arguments, which is that a Raspberry Pi is actually quite powerful, and many people do TLS in many environments, and it's really way more feasible than 10 years ago. So I think the constrained device argument it exists. It's a valid argument, but our valid counter arguments is that many times it's quite doable. So I hope as the working group discuss this, presumably on the list, I hope the consensus would be to make mandatory to use TLS the thing for TCP/CL version 4. I would think that would be a good outcome, but I understand Rand's counter arguments are valid. We'll see where the consensus lies.
And making it mandatory to use it necessitates that the endpoints have a TLS implementation, but to me, it's like that's the hurdle, is that making it not mandatory to use means it's possible to use it in an endpoint without any concept of TLS at all. If the endpoint doesn't know how to do anything in TLS, versus it knows how to do TLS, but it only supports some trivial cipher suites.
Stan Ratliff, IDirect. This sounds like it might be somewhat parallel to some discussions we had in MAN-A with a protocol called DLEP, where we had deployments that were both across the standard internet and were able to use TLS, and then a second set of deployments that we call dedicated deployments, where in our case it was a router, a highly classified military radio, 2 IP phones, and a laptop that went into a tank, with the idea being that since our protocol ran between the router and the highly classified radio, somebody was going to break into the tank. They weren't going to do it to put a wire shark on our line. Right? There were other issues afoot. So I wonder if possibly you should consider the notion of, based on different deployment models and where and how these nodes get deployed, then either TLS should be mandatory, or in some of the other more tightly controlled, especially those with physical access characteristics, TLS is more of an option. Just a thought.
Stephen Pearl again. Rand pointed out that I probably should clarify, and I am, that null cipher suites are pretty awful, and I would not like us to allow support for those. And if we look at BCP 195, which is the modern guidance for TLS, it says you must not negotiate null cipher suites. So in regardless of where we land on mandatory to use, mandatory to implement, I think null cipher suites should be off the table, and we should follow BCP 195.
Okay, I'm going to cut the line on the. Okay, go on, Stephen.
Sorry, Stephen Pearl again. I do have one other issue. TLS 1.3 is a fantastic thing, and has all sorts of wonderful improvements, but it also has zero RTT, which will appear attractive in a DTN, and would mean that somebody could, in principle, replay against a different data center. So the known attack about zero RTT exists. It will be attractive to look at that, to want that in a DTN. I'm not sure that the DTN implementations will be sophisticated enough to do this safely. So I would argue that in doing this, probably TLS 1.3 will be ahead of this document in the RC editor type queues. So I would kind of say that, say use TLS, follow BCP 195, and when TLS 1.3 is out, don't use zero RTT. But I think that's a discussion that the working group should have, because it will be attractive.
Okay, I'm cutting the line on the TLS conversation, because I know Brian has one or two more slides, yes. I think. Let's get that discussion on the list, because there's lots of opinion, and I'm not convinced we've got consensus on what the way forward is. And I think both sides of the argument have some very valid points, but it's going to run, and we'll keep going.
Okay, so you can skip to the next slide then for some more argumentative topics. So as written right now, the TCP/CL v4 uses the same and extends the same message type codes, refuse bundle reason codes, and shutdown reason codes. It adds a new set of codes for rejecting messages. And there were some comments that came on the exact phrasing of the message names in v4, and the reason why the message names are in v4 written as they are is because they match identically the message names and codes in v3. So the question is simply, is it better to reuse the IANA registries for v3 just for the sake of reusing the registries, or is it better and more recommended to just simply create new registries? And if the type codes happen to line up with the old registries, then that's a nice convenience. But it gives us the opportunity to rename the messages in a more consistent way with the simplified sequencing of v4. And I don't have any.
Okay, Rick, with a quick question.
That's the reason why it's my own question.
Yeah, Rick, with the devil's advocate question here, is that if we reuse the TCPL v3 registry space registrations and add codes to it, that implies that those codes are valid for TCPL v3. Am I right? Or I'm not right. So the V3 can say, although this is my registered IANA registry, these new codes are being added by TCP V4, and there's nothing in the V3 document that says, I'm wondering whether we're going to get into registry confusion here.
I think, Rand Atkinson, I think we're going to be okay. I think what happens is that in the end, you know, we have an internet draft that says blah, 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 these additional codes apply to V4. And then when that draft becomes an RFC, then the postulate is that supersedes, replaces the V3 draft, right? And so that scenario has, as I outlined it, has happened N times. Yeah. And there's not an issue with reusing the same registry. And there is some advantage to an implementer and in terms of general confusion to use the same registry.
Rick, again, absolutely, I understand that process. But if we're doing something like mandating usage of TLS for V4 and saying, but V3 can live on as your non-TLS alternative, which I think was floated as an idea, God knows if that'll be the consensus. In that case, then we have V3 and V4 live at the same time, and then we have a registry clash.
Rand Atkinson, in that case, and I kind of suspect we won't end up there. I'm not sure if we're going to end up in a neighborhood I like, but I don't think we're likely to end up in that neighborhood. If we did, the sensible thing to do would be to spin the V3 draft, and basically, if it does not, I don't remember what's in the draft or in the document, but if it doesn't already say, have some language about ignore unrecognized codes, then you simply put in ignore unrecognized codes and then maybe add a text comment somewhere, you know, that additional codes only apply to later versions.
Do we consider that this is quite an esoteric topic about wordsmithing and should be taken to the list? I'm looking at my responsible AD and the various long-term IETFers here for some advice for Brian and myself as well.
Jörg, or just curiosity, if we are since we're talking V3 and V4 and maybe something else, we need to get a different port number, right?
Right.
Yeah, maybe.
And otherwise, you won't be demuxing them on the same thing because they aren't compatible. Especially if we start running TLS all the time, then another implementation wouldn't work. And at least we should try to figure out how to make that fail or not connect in consistent and predictable ways.
There is a version number.
Following on from that, I think that might be there is a version number, but that's the crux of the question is, actually, is this a new protocol that needs a new port, or is it an upgrade from, is it just version 4 of version 3, you know?
You are going to get a TLS record first.
Well, if we go that way, we'll get a TLS record first. If we stick with the start TLS method, then you'll get a TLS record 7.
Even in the pure TLS implementation.
But that's an open question.
As long as we figure out a consistent way how to handle all of this.
Even in a pure TLS implementation, there would still be that magic string at the start of the contact. And so you would be able to still, that's plain text. Even in a pure TLS implementation, I would say that deserves to be plain text, just so that you can, as you said, distinguish between V3 and V4.
Brian, the various looks on various faces in the room here is that's not going to wash.
Do any of the faces in the room need to get up and say something? Maybe not. Spencer Dawkins. So since I was invoked, and thank you for that. So I'm understanding that you're doing this and that the meanings are going to be the same for the reused values between V3 and V4. Is that a true statement?
The sequencing and concepts are the same, although the payload is different. So
that could be okay.
Up front, as far as the connection establishment, the magic code in the header that distinguishes between v3 and v4 as it's written today. And so interpreting the message type codes is all conditional on v3 or v4.
Right. So I'm thinking, strings and IANA registries are pretty cheap. So if these things were going to be vaguely the same, but you would know that they're different, they would, they're the same concept, but the behavior is different between V3 and V4, then I would be asking you all to do a different registry, not so, mostly so you're not going to confuse the people that are coding V4. Okay. If the concepts are really close, and you're really just adding, I think reusing it is fine. But I repeat, don't try to reuse it really hard because IANA registry strings are cheap.
Thanks, Spencer. I think that's good advice.
To me, it's perfectly,
From the conversation we had with Brian.
yeah, to me, it's perfectly fine to create
Sorry,
a
go ahead,
registry. I see no reason against it at all. If it's going to avoid confusion and avoid any kind of problems like that.
Do you want to go to the next slide? Oh, one.
Spencer, again, I'm just to confirm, I don't know how confused you all are going to get. So please don't take my guidance as particularly strong guidance, but just as advice. You all will know how confused you are, and you will do the right thing, right?
Go ahead, Brian.
To me, using new registries is a reasonable thing, and it seems like there would be no objection to that. It would just avoid the whole problem. And if there happen to be type IDs, numbers, enumerations that line up between V3 and V4, then that's a convenience. So we can go to the next slide. There was a question raised about extensibility in the TCP/CL. So in an earlier draft of V4, all of the contact negotiation was done through a type length value type sequence header. There were concerns about that being a bit too complex to decode in the trivial case where you're exchanging the same sequence of parameters every time. And in the last draft of V4, it was simplified so that the contact header is purely fixed length. The fixed length data encoding, there is a variable length string, but it's length encoded on a fixed bit size length number. So V4, as it's written right now, is practically fixed length in the contact header, which avoided the use of any kind of variability in the contents of that contact header. And that means that there is no possibility as written right now for extensibility. I am perfectly fine with adding in as I've written on that fourth bullet item, a non-SDNV, meaning fixed size encoding TLV header sequence to the draft spec, although in the current notion of what is TCP/CL v4, there would be no definitions. The type registry would be empty. So I can see some arguments against, I'm not making them, but I can see arguments against this header structure that right now is unused. So it's an open question as far as, do we want extensibility? I'm perfectly fine with including that to allow for basically arbitrary exchange within the contact header.
Ran Atkinson, I don't have an immediate use case that would require extensibility. In other IETF protocols, when there was no way to extend things, almost always, a use case arose later where the ability to have TLVs added that were optional that made sense in a particular user community. That's almost always happened. I don't currently have a use case though.
There was some discussion, I believe it was from Rick Taylor, about including some kind of ability to do discovery of EIDs based on established contacts or things like that. So that's an example of how this could be used. Although I'm not proposing to write up any kind of actual use for this thing in the draft. So the short version is I'm fine with adding in this TLV header sequence as long as it's not going to cause any headaches or problems with the protocol getting approved. So if there's no other comments, then we can go on to the next.
There you go.
And then, as I was just briefly mentioning, there was a question about neighbor discovery at the convergence layer. My own preference on this is, as of right now, I think there should not be any notion of neighbor discovery, just because I'm not exactly sure what is being discovered and from where is it being discovered. Although if there is a need to make connections to endpoints and then discover their EIDs, possibly multiple EIDs or their own secondary connectivity or something like that, then the TLV header would allow you to do that in the future. But for right now, I'm not sure what the exact discovery would be.
Okay, Rick Taylor, I was the guy who suggested this. Basically, this was part of my argument for the TLV extensibility in the protocol, simply because I'm not sure how this would work, but it kind of seems like something I want to play with. I'm not sure yet. So it's an argument for extensibility rather than an argument for putting it in as mandatory into the protocol with its own defined message structures.
Okay. And
so,
if you could step,
and I'm interested if anyone else has ideas.
if you could step back one slide, it hasn't been written yet, but if the TLV header was put in place, I think what would make sense to me would be, this is all going to be fixed bit field length. So the type would be, I'm making up a number, but the type would be a 16-bit number and so on. But the type codes, I think it makes sense to define a range for IN approved and a range for experimental. Okay.
Agreed.
I just wanted to mention that there would be reserved values for do whatever you like with it in your own way. Okay, so you can step past the neighbor discovery. This may be the end of things. Yeah. So my only concern about the draft spec is just that I know Rick had written a lot of good comments on it, but those are the only comments that have been received since the last draft was published. So taking those comments along with the discussion today, there still are some open issues, especially the security related issues, it seems.
Rick, with my chair hat on, this document needs more review. I mean, I've done a bit of a review. Brian was very prompt on comments and it's kicked off some useful discussion, but it can't just be Brian and I. So I'm sure this is of use to other people. I'm looking at people like Ran, who's got some opinions. Even 20 lines, just can people, it's in working group last call, and it's still very much in working group last call, if not bounced back out, because it's got some problems, but that's fine. We can fix those problems. But I really need to see some review on this stuff, because again, with BPBIS, and if we're moving forwards with BPSec, we need to get some review, and definitely for TCP/CL.
And as of the last draft, as of the current last draft of the V4 spec, the sequencing is greatly simplified even from the earlier drafts and from V3. The only complex sequencing I think that really exists in V4 today has to do with the start TLS and a bit of don't share EIDs outside of a TLS session if you're planning on establishing a TLS session, some hopscotch that goes along with avoiding exposing data prior to the TLS session. So to me, that is the only kind of complex sequencing that's involved in the protocol anymore. The actual messaging, the actual exchange of bundles in the current V4 draft is a very fixed sequence of messages, which is simpler than the V3 even.
So Rick again with my chair hat on, just like we said for BP-BIS, I'm tempted to say TCP/CL drops out of last call because we've got review comments that need to be addressed in the group. I'd love to get it back into last call for Prague. If we're not ready by then we're not doing our job as a working group. You know. Okay.
So I don't have anything else. Yep.
Thanks, Brian. Any other questions for Brian? Yeah. Okay, I think it's Ed on AMA.
Hi, I'm Ed again, and I wanted to talk about something we're calling the asynchronous management architecture document. So a few years ago, we were trying to answer the question how we did network management in a delayed network. We came up with the ideas, of course, that pull requests and sessions and operators in the loop aren't enough, and we came to the conclusion that performance monitoring, which is the act of getting information in front of an operator and having them react to it, is not enough, and that we needed to understand more how we could have the moral equivalent of remote procedure calls, some sort of automation and perhaps autonomy on the far end of nodes that are often disconnected, either because of physical disconnections or because they are administratively disconnected from their operation centers. What that turned into was a series of experiments and implementations and proofs of concept. And when we thought of how to write this, we broke it into 3 different sections. The first was something that we called the asynchronous management architecture, which we used to capture the key properties, desirable properties, system flows, things of that nature, associated with an asynchronous management model. There are we found no credible asynchronous management models in our literature review, so we think we're defining somewhat new ground here. And then to follow that up with separate specifications for the data model, and then finally an on-the-wire representation of that data model. So where we are now is we have an AMA document, which is an internet draft to version 5. It has gotten some review within the working group and some review from other working groups. The comments back so far have been largely positive. As we have migrated from 03 to 04 and 04 to 05, there have not been very many changes, and that's perhaps part of the high-level nature of this document. We are putting forth this document as a way of capturing what we should mean when we say network management in challenged environments. So it is from that point of view that I think we should look at this document. Again, same with BPSec. Who here has looked at this or some incarnation of this? Okay, it's about the same as BPSec, and I know we have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 from outside the working group that have looked. Same request. Please review this as well, because we like it. I like it. So if we were to walk through this in a similar way as we did with BPSec, which is here's an overall introduction to the document, the major portions of the document. What we're trying to do here is identify some high-level aspects of what an asynchronous management model would look like. Service definitions, properties, the roles and responsibilities associated, and what we call a logical data model, which is the kind of information that needs to be exchanged, even if that's separate from the physical representation or modeling of that data. The scope here, we make certain assumptions, right? We assume that we have some level of transport that's dealing with naming, addressing, security, and things of that nature. That may mean operating over BP, although we have some users who are looking at this to operate it over non-BP networks as well. And this individual document doesn't address the specific ways of interfacing asynchronous and synchronous network management schemes, although there has been some work done in that area. So when we come down to the overall motivation and trying to take that section of the document in just a few slides, we came to the realization that asynchronous management really requires at minimum automation and perhaps some semi-autonomous behavior on the role of the managed devices themselves, because often in a challenged environment, they do not have regular communications back to a manager or managing them. When we looked at things such as SNMP and NetComp, they didn't really provide all of those capabilities. Certainly, SNMP had challenges. NetComp and then the NetMod models associated with it did add some of the modeling that we needed, but from an operational standpoint and the assumptions made on sessions and round trips, the protocols themselves weren't immediately reusable. There is some work that's going on from someone named Eric Voigt over in, what work did we see?
NetMod, NetComp.
Okay, NetMod, NetComp group, to work at something called RESTComp, and we've talked with Eric. He likes this model at a high level, and perhaps there's a way that we can share his model over his protocol.
Sorry, Ed, it's not. The RESTConf is something else. He originally called it Yang Push, and it's now turning into asynchronous NetConf notifications, I think it is. The name changes as he gets moved from group to group because none of the groups want to address it yet, which he's finding a little frustrating. He's not here to defend himself, so I'll say no more.
And we've talked with Eric quite a bit, and I think adopting the asynchronous nature of the terminology is good because I think that's a better description of what we're trying to accomplish. So we felt that a document like this, accompanied with the logical data model, is a good way of converging thinking in this area. We looked through the kind of services that should be provided, and we came back and said, here were sort of the 4 large services, and this is sort of a nod to the fact that in whole level management schemes, monitoring and reporting is most of what is done, and we may need a couple other items. Obviously, configuration is important as a service. You want the ability to configure the state of a managed device, or to have a managed device configure its own state in accordance to predefined response options or some level of monitoring. Sometimes that means being able to create new versions of data that it can calculate on its own from the set of measurable information available to it. Sometimes it is choosing to create new subsets of data to report on beyond predefined reports, and to store predefined actions that can be done in response to local events, if not globally synchronized. From a reporting perspective, and we'll talk about this in the next slide as well, you want to be a push model and not a pull model. The pull model does require some negotiation and session and understanding of what you're pulling and how to associate the push, the reports coming back with the pull request that's asking for them. And you want to be able to push as a function of time, of course, but also as a function of local state. And then autonomous parameterized procedure calls. There's a lot of inefficiency in some of the ways we do RPCs now. Sometimes, if we go back to the old examples of trying to do SNMP associative array lookups, you have to make several requests back and forth to figure out how indexes are done and how you sub-index or pre-allocate the data that you might want to look up in that way. We need some level of intelligent parameterization to avoid that kind of round tripping, and also the fact that we need to have the ability to do procedure calls, but in a well-named way. And then finally, while you assume that the transport layer has some level of security, you probably need a layer on top of that, which is more access control in terms of who is allowed to request what data and who is allowed to perform certain actions. So from there, we refine that into sort of the desirable properties of a system like this in a challenged network. Intelligent push is a big one. Absolute data identification, some of the associative lookups is important. The ability to find your own custom data is there. And then we talk about autonomous operation. There are a couple of flavors of that, some of which is simple automation. if X is greater than 3, then generate this report. If the number of integrity failures is higher than some threshold asserted or computed, then go rotate your key or go to a safe mode or something of that nature. But then, and that goes to the idea of we need a distributed operation model because we don't have a centralized controller. So the nice part about at least that automation piece is you will need deterministic behavior. At some point when your node is back in communication with your operations center or your managers and something has happened, you want to be able to say, because we understood certain aspects of how the system is configured, at the end of some reaction chain, we're able to piece back together forensically what happened. The other is we prefer and recommend engine-based behavior. There are certain scenarios where deploying mobile code or simple scripting engines to do this gets into resource issues and more security issues. A overall system model, the graphic here is pulled from a different document, which is why it says AMP for asynchronous management protocol as opposed to the architecture, but this is conformant with the architecture. We suppose that we would have agents, managers, and something that we're called application data models, which are sort of a moral equivalent and superset of a MIB or a Yang model that is used to create a common schema that's used between managers and agents on different devices. And essentially to well name the data model. From a roles and responsibilities standpoint, we break the world into agents and managers, which is fairly common in network management terminology and roles. The agents do a certain level of collection, applying automation and autonomy, reporting, and so on. And then the managers have data collection, translation, and in some cases, data fusion responsibilities as well. When we talk about the logical data model, we propose that this is the set of information that needs to be collected to manage the overall network, where we talk about a top level across the top row of externally defined data, literals, operators, and controls, which are things that are immutable by definition. If we say for a particular application or particular protocol, this is the data that the firmware or application will produce. These are sensor measurements or other data that are available, and it is well named. Same thing with literals, same things with operators when you're using point expressions, and then the controls themselves, which are, these are the opcodes, the well-defined parameterized opcodes that must be available by any implementation, manageable implementation of that application protocol. And then there's a series of user-defined information as well, which are variables, strongly typed variables that can be defined to be computed and returned by the agent, macros, which are ordered sequences of controls, and then reports, and then also state and time-based rules. So separate from the physical representation of this information, which we're proposing in a separate document, which would be a Yang template, and we are working on some ways of reducing the size of that as making binary names and binary encodings and so on. This is the logical data model, and we would always appreciate a review of that to see if there are any other kinds of primitive information or data information necessary to get the kind of control model that we're looking for. Over the past, one of the things that was proposed, and it is, we're sort of treating it, it's not represented here, that has been added are the concept of tables and whether we need tables as part of this model, and we think that we do. So that's something that has come out with review. Other than that, the only other thing I wanted to go over was just some of the beautiful text art that is in the spec itself, which lays out sort of the higher level control and data flows between agents on node A, manager on node C, and the concept that you can have both agents and managers on a node itself, where a manager on node B can accept information in from multiple agents, perform its own data fusion, and that result can be communicated to someone else by being sampled by an agent itself on node B and then sending it back. So when we talk about agents and managers, we don't necessarily mean that these are individual applications, they are just roles. And so one software load can be solely an agent, one can be solely a manager, and one could be both. If we go through some of the intelligent push and so on, if we have a simple serialized case managers, agents A and B, A manager can request at some communications point or configuration point, please produce at 1 second some externally defined data for agent 1, and please produce at some regular interval, for example, 1 second, the same data from agent B, and then that's really it. And then from that point on, these agents can push that data back as necessary, the example of time-based production. You can hypothesize, and we don't need to walk through the specific example, it's a little bit long, where you can have multiple managers trying to communicate with a single agent. There's not a requirement that there be a single manager in the network, and in fact, we envision that many times there will not be a single manager in the network. And we presume that managers themselves will be able to pull data in and fuse it and make it available for others. And this would be an example where, for example, you may have a sensor cluster and the cluster head would have both a manager and an agent on it. As it collects information from the sensor cluster, it does fusion and decimation and so on for that data, and then provides the summaries back out again with the one use case. So that's a general overview of the document. It does talk about the desirable properties, system views, logical data models, and the relationships between agents and managers. And the real question becomes, is this set of high order motivation and architecture going to provide what we need to be able to do the kind of asynchronous network management we think we have to do in the DTN? So the implementation, there are some experimental implementations out there to prove some of those concepts. They have run, some of them are run on the ISS, some of them are run in simulation environments. We seem to be able to do the kind of things that we want to do with them based on the use cases we've laid out. The question to the working group is, to the extent that we have had review of this document and to the extent in which we have a request to make some intelligent statements about network management in this space, does this architecture document provide what we need to answer that question?
So, thank you, Ed. Are you asking for this to be adopted as a working group document if people like it?
So yes, if people believe that this captures what we need to do asynchronous management for DTNs, and if we have a charter item for doing management or capturing the requirements or the desirable properties of such network management, I propose that this document fits that working group charter item.
Scott Burley, I may have gotten confused at some point. I thought that that the asynchronous management work was being taken up by another working group in another area. Is that not the case?
So we originally, and this was going back 2 or 3 IETFs, had discussed moving it to the Ops AD.
Right.
I don't know that there was resistance to that, but I believe that the DTN working group said keep it here.
Oh, okay.
But I will defer.
Okay.
Come on.
Currently, the charter says that we could work on network management requirements. I'm not sure that's requirements, so again, we're stuck with the current charter unless the AD wants to have us, update the charter with, real network management stuff. Protocol architecture and all that stuff.
So what I would say is when we looked through this particular document versus the physical data model draft and any protocol draft, we did not interpret requirements as like a series of shell statements. We looked at it in terms of things that the system had to do. So from a desirable property standpoint and from a services rendered standpoint. And in that case, we would claim that the idea is that we would claim that this captures from a sort of a user story perspective how we believe network management should be operated without prescribing the physical mechanisms for that. So that may not mesh exactly with the requirements, but we looked at it as desirable properties, system characteristics, and user stories on how these things work together.
Rick Taylor from start that again. Rick Taylor from Speaking Personally. I think the AMA document may address the requirements because it's talking about an architecture and general use cases and so on. I think the AMP, the underlying protocol work and some of the data model documents that Ed also has put in as IDs, I think they are out of charter at the moment, and I'm not sure they're ready to be accepted as working group documents. So I'd push back on that. But I personally, I'm in favor of AMA being adopted as a working group item. I don't think we should. I'm very happy to personally and as a chair to go out and try and attract some interest within the rest of the greater NetMod, NetConf, MANE, and see what everyone's doing for data modeling outside of the data center. But I think as a working group, we need to concentrate on BPBIS, BPSec, TCP/CL right now. They're the critical ones. But sure, let's take it on board, but not have it as a distraction.
Yeah, Scott Burley again, and I agree with that.
So looking back at the AD, can we change our charter to remove management requirements to management architecture? Given I don't think anyone's going to write a requirements doc, but we have an architecture doc.
Spencer Dawkins, responsible ID. Is this because everybody kind of knows what the requirements are already?
So I would say that we've been thinking about sort of what's required in these spaces for a couple of years. We didn't want to write things down as formally as shell statements, but if we say these are the properties that the system must have, and these are the services that must be supported, and here is the kind of data exchange that you need to be able to implement. I think that we call it an architecture document, but those are as close to requirements as you can get without saying here is a large list of shell statements.
So I would say that from my short time with DTN as responsible ID, you all seem to be a pretty tight group. And I could believe that, you talk to each other and kind of mostly nod your heads up and down at the same time when people talk about this. So it's okay with me that this does not look like a requirements document that you could throw over the wall to somebody. But this is going to be a good conversation for me to take up with the OPS-IDs, and especially because we have a new one. But I will take the action to do that, and please feel free to put that in the minutes so that you can ask me why I didn't do that in Prague if that did not happen.
Jefferson Aubrey. There used to be a DTN management requirements draft, right? I think I don't know if it's still relevant because I think it's in the DTN research group. But as far as I know, I think it's 5 years from now or something like this. So I don't know if it's still interesting, but maybe we can, revisit it or something.
So if it's some of the documents that I think of, we were involved with those when they happened. I don't know if this was some of Will Ivanchik's work or some other. We can certainly revisit. There was a lot of discussion as to whether the use cases that were put forward in defense of some of those requirements were duplicative, whether they were representative of the overall user communities. And we found time and again that trying to nail things down in more firm requirements language for the space users versus the IoT users versus some of the other users, there just always seemed to be something in the shells that wasn't universal. And that's why we abstracted into services and properties as opposed to requirements themselves.
No, I see that. Maybe I think that maybe it's a good idea to have to split the document and to have a separate document for the requirements and still maintain the document for the architecture. Like two different things.
We can certainly look at it. Yeah, if there are useful requirement statements that we can use, that's always a good thing.
And if you would like to help, you would be very welcome.
Yeah.
I know it's not a working group document, but
No, I'm willing to help. So.
Oh, yeah, if we can work together on a separate requirement spec to the architecture.
or part the two.
Or part the two in some.
Okay, good advice.
We're pretty much done. I have one request if we've got no more questions for Ed. I know some guys from, I think it's Beijing University, have submitted a couple of individual drafts to DTN. I hope you're listening or will hear this on the audio. I tried to email you, but all my emails bounce. I would love to actually speak to you about the work you're submitting. Perhaps you'd like to present or, we have remote participation facilities. So this is a sort of a request to these guys, please try and get in contact on the list or find an email address that I can contact from the UK. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone. Has everyone filled in the blue sheets? Most people have crept off early, so hopefully they filled them in before they snuck out. And any other business? And we're done, I think. See you all in Prague.